Okay, studying in an Americanized educational system for all my life, I've had the feeling that all my education was focused on one side of the coin, the side of the West. The world history course I took in ninth grade could be more aptly named The History of the West and a Bit About the Others. With this semester of History of China, I feel that I finally delved into the world of the East, uncovering a whole new story. I began to realize that it wasn't really about the facts, it was more about the perspective. History of China offered me a whole new take towards history. It was both refreshing and very interesting to experience 4,000 years of human history through the eyes of the Chinese. What I had found most interesting about the history of China was that how early precedents and philosophies could impact the nation for thousands of years. In this sense, China is truly one nation with one continuous history, with periods that are dynasties. For starters, the Chinese have always been problem solvers. Shun himself had taken a plow and dug out canals with his own hands to solve the problem, which was the flood. Throughout history, the Chinese had undertaken huge construction projects to solve problems. Just look at the Qin dynasty's building of the Great Wall to keep out nomads, the Sui dynasty's building of the Grand Canal to promote trade, and the Ming dynasty's construction of the Forbidden Palace. One of the earliest precedents set in Chinese history is the emphasis on the farm and supporting the family, starting with the teachings of Shen Nong, one of the three emperors and five sovereigns, and until today, China placed agriculture in very high regard. Isolated by geography, China had early been a self-sufficient nation, a close-knit collectivist society focusing more on the family and the country than the individual. Aspects of this philosophy can be observed throughout the entirety of Chinese history. Han Wudi, when in need of a revenue, first looked at the merchant class for taxes. When compared to the farmer that provided food for the entire nation, the capitalist merchant was deemed a parasite. In the Ming dynasty, among the four classes of society, the Nong, or the peasant, was only below the learned aristocrat, the Shi, surpassing the Gong, or the craftsman, and of course the Shang, the merchant. The PRC under Mao continued to value the peasant, the farm, and the family. To benefit the peasants, Mao had redistributed land and had attempted to benefit their lives through modernization. From its earliest roots, China had been raised with a communist mindset, caring more about the society as a whole rather than the individual. Another precedent established in the Xia dynasty was the idea of transforming virtue. First noticeable was Yu, who dominated the Miao tribe not by brute force but by showing them compassion and virtue. This theme is recurrent in Chinese history. The Xianbei who had conquered the northern portions of China had eventually Sinicized, adopting Chinese values and traditions. The outstanding virtue of the Chinese had transformed them, causing them to become Chinese. The Jurchens, who conquered most of northern China, also ended up Sinicizing. The two, the, wait, the two Chinese dynasties, the Yuan and the Qing, were also, in fact, set up by conquering barbarians who eventually Sinicized and established dynasties. Another outstanding example of transforming virtue can be observed with Zheng He's treasure fleet. While the fleet had obviously possessed the military firepower to dominate all it encountered, they chose to respect the natives, giving them lavish gifts and treating them as equals in trade. Just compare this attitude with the attitude of the Europeans, who merely chose to conquer and proselytize. As tribute states, such nations that China encountered were promised protection as long as they provided tribute. A final recurring theme in Chinese history is the idea of meritocracy and the value of education. For his successor, Emperor Yao had picked the filial, assiduous, and reverent Shun as his successor over his sons. This set the ultimate precedent. China would forever value the learned and the accomplished. The Shang court had two ministries dedicated to educating the young, the ministries of instruction and music. The Ministry of Music was especially unique in its approach of using music to instill a sense of propriety, temper hotheads, and encouraging the shy. Han Wudi of the Han Dynasty had established the civil service exams as a form of filtering out the accomplished and putting them into service. Astonishingly, the civil service exams would stay in place until the Qing dynasties, almost 2,000 years later. Confucius's teachings valued the gentleman, the learned man greatly. To quote his words, to think without studying is a waste of time, yet to study without thinking is a waste of time, yet to think without studying is dangerous. Even today, 92% of China is literate. A huge emphasis is given to education as a gateway of getting ahead. To an extent, the PRC censoring of controversial media is, in fact, a way of filtering out the material that may be harmful to China's use. However, in more recent days, there has been a noticeable decline in such traditional Chinese values. More and more farmers are migrating to cities, which is undermining China's agricultural base. By 2011, a stunning 252.11 million Chinese were migrant workers working in cities, a 4% increase from 2010. With the establishment of Deng's special economic zones, China has become more and more capitalist. While the Communist Party's excuse is that a capitalist phase is required to achieve a socialist state, this is still an alarming deviation from China's traditional values. The allure of quick money has eclipsed the ardent desire for education. All these patterns seem to be side effects of China's encounter with the one barbarian tribe that did not synthesize, the Westerners. One of my earliest goals in HSC was to figure out just why China had fallen behind the West. For hundreds of years, China had been the dominant superpower on the planet. The Ming Dynasty's 100-ship-strong treasure fleet was incomparable to the Christopher Columbus's measly 3-ship fleet. Well, now I have the answer to my question: industrialization. It was simply the fact that the West industrialized earlier than China that allowed it to dominate China in the century of humiliation. So now, why couldn't China industrialize as early as the West? The Song at the prime were primed to industrialize. It had access to coal, steel, had plenty of land, sufficient capital, and a bubbling population after the recently completed Grand Canal allowed food to be moved to large cities. Inventions were flourishing, but everything changed when the Mongols attacked, completely upsetting the infrastructure. The Industrial Revolution for China, which could have happened in the 11th century, 500 years before Britain, was frozen right in its tracks. The flooding of the Huanghe is often called China's sorrow, but in my opinion, this, along with Emperor Hongle's burning of the treasure fleet, which could have established a Chinese empire, is more appropriately China's sorrow. After taking this course, I feel as if I relearned history through a different lens. My only regret is that it was a semester course, and we could not dive into the details as much and as deeply as I would have wanted. I don't believe the completion of this course marks the end of my learning of Chinese history. Chinese history is happening right now. Education is also a lifelong endeavor. Just look at Emperor Kangxi. Thanks for listening. 再见。